William of Normandy died face down in the churned mud below a Sussex ridge in the autumn of 1066, and England never became Norman. The Duke who had crossed the Channel with the Pope's blessing, who had burned a county to bait his enemy into the open, fell to an English army that should never have been there to meet him. For most of that long year, almost nothing had gone Harold Godwinson's way, and the kingdom he had been crowned to hold seemed to be slipping toward three different conquerors at once. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Edward the Confessor died childless on the 5th of January, 1066, and the great men of England crowned Harold Godwinson king the following day. It was a swift choice, and it left enemies. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed Edward had promised him the throne, and that Harold himself had sworn an oath upholding that claim while a guest in Normandy around 1064. Far to the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway pressed his own ancient claim, and Harold's exiled brother Tostig sailed at his side. A king with three rivals could not afford a single mistake. Through the summer, Harold did everything correctly. He kept the fyrd, the levy of free landholders mustered along the south coast, and held a fleet near the Isle of Wight, watching for Norman sails. But an army cannot eat the air. In early September the supplies failed, and Harold disbanded the southern fyrd and sent the fleet home. Within days the year turned against him. Hardrada and Tostig crushed the northern earls Edwin and Morcar at Fulford on the 20th of September. Harold marched the length of his kingdom and destroyed the Norwegian army at Stamford Bridge on the 25th, killing both Hardrada and Tostig in an afternoon. He had won, and while he stood victorious in Yorkshire, William's fleet caught its wind at last and landed unopposed at Pevensey on the 28th. The Duke raised a castle at Hastings and waited. Harold turned his exhausted, triumphant army around and rode south. What he decided when he reached London would matter more than any battle he had yet fought. Harold reached London in the first days of October with a victory still fresh and a body of men who could barely stand. His housecarls, the professional corps of any English army, had marched roughly 200 miles in a handful of days to reach Stamford Bridge, fought a brutal battle, and now faced the same distance again in reverse. They were not beaten. They were worn to the bone. His brothers wanted speed. Gurth, Earl of East Anglia and Leofwine, who held lands in the southeast, urged an immediate march on Hastings. William was burning the villages around his beachhead, much of it Godwin family land, precisely to provoke a hasty answer. Strike now, the brothers argued, and the English might trap the Normans against the sea before they could choose their ground. There was a cold logic to it, and Harold knew that every day he waited was another day of English peasants watching their homes turn to ash. But Harold looked at the men around him and made a different choice. He would not march in days. He would wait 2 weeks. He sent riders out to recall the southern fyrd he had disbanded in September, the same free landholders who had watched the coast all summer and ordered fresh levies from the shires that had not yet bled. He let the housecarls of Stamford Bridge sleep, eat, and tend their wounds. He gathered the full strength of England rather than spending its tired remnant. It was a gamble against William's banner, consecrated by Pope Alexander II, and against the quiet presence at court of Edgar Atheling, the last male of the House of Wessex, whom a defeated Harold would leave as the only English claimant. If the wait failed, it would fail completely. But what those 2 weeks brought him would decide everything that came after. When Harold finally moved, he moved with an army at full strength and a clear head. He took the high ground first, a long ridge across the road inland from Hastings, and there he set his shield wall. Housecarls rested and rooted at the center, fyrdmen deep and unhurried on either side. The men had eaten, they had slept, they knew the ground beneath their feet. William had no choice but to come to them. His host combined cavalry, infantry, and archers, and on another autumn it might have been enough. The Norman archers loosed uphill, and the arrows lost their bite against the slope. The infantry pushed into the shield wall and were thrown back. Then came the cavalry, the pride of the Norman host, horsemen under commanders such as Eustace of Boulogne, and the wall did not break. A line of fresh, disciplined men, packed shield to shield, was a wall of timber and iron, and the horses would not throw themselves onto the spears. The Normans tried the trick that might have won the day. A body of horsemen broke and fled, hoping to lure the English down the slope into the open, where cavalry could ride them apart. Against tired, thinned ranks it could have worked. Against fyrdmen who had slept and stood at full depth, the line held its shape and let the riders go. The retreat drew no one out. Through the long afternoon, the Normans spent themselves against the ridge, charge after charge, until the slope was thick with fallen horses. And somewhere in the press, in the failing light, William of Normandy was pulled from his saddle and killed. The army that had crossed the Channel with the blessing of Rome dissolved without the man who had summoned it. A leaderless invasion does not retreat in order. It scatters. The survivors of Hastings made for their ships or for the castle at Hastings, and many never reached either. With William dead, the expedition had no purpose and no heir on English soil to give it one. The Duke had carried the whole enterprise in his own person, and his person was gone. The consequences crossed the Channel faster than the news could be softened. William's eldest son was young, and Normandy slid into the disputed fractious minority that always threatened a duchy when a strong duke fell early. The barons who had gambled their fortunes on the English crown came home, if they came home at all, to a duchy turning inward on its own quarrels rather than outward on conquest. In England, the effect was the reverse. Harold returned to London not as a king clinging to a contested throne, but as a king who had answered all three of his rivals in a single season. Hardrada lay dead in Yorkshire. Tostig lay beside him. William lay in Sussex. The English church, which had watched the papal banner with unease, made its peace with the anointed king who had survived. The earls and thegns who might have wavered now had nothing to waver toward. Edgar Atheling remained at court, a boy of the old royal line, but a dormant claim is only a claim, and Harold's was settled. The succession crisis that had haunted England since Twelfth Night was, for the first time, simply over. Harold's first task was not conquest but repair, and he proved better suited to it than the year had let him show. The north had suffered most. Edwin and Morcar, the young earls of Mercia and Northumbria, had been broken at Fulford and had contributed little to the campaign that saved the kingdom. A harder king might have stripped them of their earldoms. Harold did not. He reconciled rather than replaced them. The Godwin family had spent 2 generations learning that England's earls could not simply be commanded, they had to be bound in. Harold confirmed the northern earls in their lands, accepted their renewed loyalty, and left the structure of the old kingdom standing, its earldoms, its shire courts, its thegns. He also moved to secure what every medieval king feared to leave open, the succession. His sons gave the line a future that did not depend on a single battlefield, and the memory of 1066, when 3 claimants had nearly torn England apart, made the lesson plain to everyone at court. With the south quiet and the north reconciled, Harold's attention drifted where English kings' attention had long been pulled across the North Sea. Norway had been bled white at Stamford Bridge, but the Scandinavian world remained England's nearest mirror in language, trade, and law. The kingdom Harold rebuilt was not a fortress facing France. It was a realm facing the cold sea to its east, and that orientation would shape the centuries to come. The deepest change of all was the change that did not happen. No Norman ruling class came ashore to stay. No foreign aristocracy replaced the English thegians in their halls, took their lands, and brought a foreign tongue into every court and charter. England in this timeline kept its own people at the top of its own society, and that single absence rippled through everything. Old English remained the language of the court, the law, and the written record. It went on absorbing Norse words from the Danelaw and the North Sea trade, as it always had, but it was never flooded by the French of a conquering elite. The English of this world stayed a Germanic language in its bones, its grammar, and its everyday vocabulary unbroken. A landholder of the next century would still have understood the speech of his grandfather without strain. The law followed the same path. Anglo-Saxon custom, the shire court and the hundred court, the oath and the wergild, the assembly of free men, judging their neighbors, continued to develop along its own lines, slowly, locally, without a foreign template imposed from above. There was no Domesday survey, driven by a conqueror's need to catalogue a seized kingdom. There was no sudden ring of stone castles built to hold a hostile population down. England remained recognizably itself, a patchwork of local custom, knit loosely under a king who ruled with his earls rather than over them. It was not a tidier England, and not always a fairer one. It was simply an England that had never been interrupted. For Normandy, the failed invasion was a wound that did not heal cleanly. William's authority had rested on momentum, on victory, on plunder, on the prestige of a duke who delivered, a duke who instead delivered a shattered army and his own corpse left behind no such magic for his heirs. The treasure of England never flowed back across the Channel to enrich Norman abbeys and reward Norman barons. The duchy stayed roughly what it had been, a middling French duchy among other French duchies, ambitious, quarrelsome, and firmly bound into the orbit of the French crown. The great cross-channel state of the other timeline never formed. In the history we know, the conquest fused England and Normandy into a single Anglo-Norman realm, whose kings spoke French, held lands on both sides of the water, and spent centuries entangled in the wars of France. None of that took shape here. The Channel did not become an internal waterway of one sprawling dynasty. It stayed a border. That border drew the political map differently. English kings were not also French vassals, and so they were not dragged into the long quarrels over Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine that defined the other England's medieval centuries. The rivalry that would have run for 400 years simply had no root to grow from. England looked north and east, to Scandinavia and the North Sea trade. France settled its own internal questions without an English claimant complicating every one of them, and then came the slow, quiet working out of everything those 2 weeks at London had set in motion. Across the generations, the absence compounded. English kept its Germanic shape, and the great divide of the other timeline, a French-speaking elite above an English-speaking commons, never opened. The language that emerged was richer in Norse than in French, plainer in its everyday words, and it never carried that long memory of conquest folded into its grammar. A poet of this England wrote in an unbroken line, from the old alliterative verse, not across a rupture. The law grew from Anglo-Saxon roots without the graft. There was no single moment when a conqueror's clerks redrew the map of who owned what. Landholding stayed tangled in older custom, the local courts kept their authority, and the king remained a first among powerful men rather than the apex of a steep new pyramid. Whether that produced a freer England or merely a slower one is a fair question, and not an easy one. A realm without a strong central conqueror is also a realm more open to its own internal quarrels. The feudal map of northwestern Europe settled along North Sea lines rather than channel lines. England, Scandinavia, and the trading towns of the Eastern Sea formed one loose world. France and its duchies formed another, and the Channel ran between them as a genuine frontier. It is tempting to call this the England that was saved, but that would be the wrong word. Harold's England carried its own costs, a looser kingdom, slower to centralize, with the northern earls never fully tamed, and the old rivalries never fully resolved. Nothing about it was guaranteed. It rested on a victorious army that chose to rest, on a king who weighed his brother's urgency against his soldiers' exhaustion, and decided that 2 weeks were worth the risk. He might have been wrong. The fyrd might not have come when he called. The whole alternate world turns on a single judgment made by a tired man in London in the autumn of 10,066, and the measure of how much hung on it is that, in the history we actually inherited, he made the other choice.